O homem é o macaco que cozinha, uma criatura do fogo. Esta é a tese do primatologista britânico radicado nos Estados Unidos, Richard Wrangham, autor de um livro polêmico, Pegando Fogo, Como Cozinhar nos Tornou Humanos, publicado recentemente no Brasil. Ao contrário de outros cientistas da área, que colocam a descoberta do fogo e o cozimento dos alimentos numa época bem recente da evolução humana, Wrangham desenvolve a hipótese, ainda não confirmada, de que isso ocorreu muito antes. Segundo ele, o fogo e a cozinha foram descobertos pelos antecessores do gênero humano, há quase 2 milhões de anos. Ele afirma que cozinhar os alimentos foi o que nos diferenciou dos outros primatas e permitiu o desenvolvimento do cérebro e de outras características humanas. Cozinhar, ele diz, tornou-se uma tarefa das fêmeas enquanto os machos caçavam. Uma divisão sexual do trabalho que se perpetuou através dos milênios. Mas, segundo o autor, a tecnologia do nosso tempo finalmente libertou as mulheres da cozinha. A divisão de tarefas entre homens e mulheres não faz mais sentido. Richard Wrangham falou ao milênio na Universidade de Harvard, onde ensina evolução humana, numa bela tarde de primavera.
This sentence in your book that we are the cooking apes, the creatures of flame. Explain that.
Well, you know, we often think of ourselves as a species that is just like every other species, just capable of living on its own. And I think the sense in which we are tied to fire is a really deep one. We have relationships with fire that are compulsory. Almost everything you see around you when you're in a created environment, when you're in a house, has been made by fire. But when you and I look at each other, we've been made by fire. We absolutely depend on fire. Any society, the fireplace is a critical member of that society. So you really can't think of humans as an independent species. Even when we go into space, the space objects have been made by fire, and we depend on fire for moving ourselves around there. But it's this fundamental aspect that we are created by fire because we need the foods that have been tended by fire.
So your theory is about the biological importance of cooking for human evolution. You discovered how that happened. And why wasn't that discovered before?
I think a clue comes from Darwin, because Darwin said that the discovery of the control of fire is probably the greatest discovery ever made by man, excepting language. But he said it's been made by man. And as long as you think that it was humans that discovered the control of fire, which is kind of the natural tendency to think that our intelligence enabled us to do this, then clearly it could not have had much evolutionary significance, because once we were humans, then nothing much changed in our evolution. And that's the way everyone has always thought. And I think it was my special privilege to be able to study chimpanzees, to eat like a chimpanzee, to think like a chimpanzee, that made me think about the difference between apes and humans.
So in the 70s you worked with Jane Goodall in Africa, and you wanted to study how the chimpanzees are by living like them.
Yes, I was really getting under the skin of the chimps. I ate everything that they ate, and I wanted to see what it would be like to try and really live like a chimpanzee. So I did ask her if she would approve of my going for as many days as I could last, eating just chimpanzee foods, and she said yes. I then carried it a bit more extreme, and I said I really want to live like a chimpanzee, so no clothes, and at that point she said no. And
it was the 70s.
It was the 70s, exactly. You know, what would be wrong with that? So I wanted to live like an ape, but I didn't, and in many ways I'm very grateful that I didn't, because it would be extremely unpleasant. It would be not just uncomfortable in terms of the scrapes as you go around, but you'd be incredibly hungry, and the food you would eat would be really, really nasty. Humans are, you know, we've come to expect an extraordinarily high-quality diet.
So we can't eat the same food that they eat.
So for many years, people have recognized that humans do have this unusual situation of having a gut which is less than 2/3 the size of it would be if we were a gorilla or a chimpanzee, and again, very small teeth. But the traditional explanation for this has been that it's something to do with our eating meat. And in the book I point out some of the difficulties with that. Our teeth don't look as if they're adapted to eating meat, and the way our guts work show very little indication of being well adapted to eating raw meat. But of course we know rather little about this because not many people try and eat raw meat.
So how many million years ago was cooking invented, or was it invented or discovered?
So the archaeological record doesn't tell us. And in the absence of that, I resort to the biological evidence. And the biological evidence is very clear. 3 things happened at 1.8 million years ago. First, our teeth became small. And it's difficult to see why our teeth would become small unless we were adapted to a cooked diet. Mm-hmm. Secondly, our guts became small to judge from the evidence of the reduced flaring of the ribs and the increasingly narrow pelvis. Mm. And the third thing that happened then is that at that point our ancestors lost their ability to climb really effectively in trees. Well, that may not seem very important, but it's incredibly important. If you've ever been to the African savannah and you curled up at night on the plains, in a tent you don't feel that safe unless there's a fire there. It's very difficult to imagine our ancestors sleeping on the ground without having the control of fire to protect them from predators.
That was how long ago?
1.8 million years ago. So that's what I think. I think that fire first was controlled almost 2 million years ago.
And that started the genus Homo?
Yes, that's coincident with the genus Homo, which until then had been a tree-climbing species with relatively big teeth and relatively big guts, an ape.
So we have much smaller guts than the chimpanzees, for instance.
We do.
And that's why our brains are much bigger. Why?
Well, you see an increase in the size of the brains starting from around that time and just going fairly continuously on up to the present. And in the primates, there is a very good negative relationship, inverse relationship, between the size of the brain and the size of the gut. And there's a good logic for this. The logic is that brains are metabolically expensive, and so are guts. If you're going to be able to grow a large brain, you have to have less energy given to some other part of the body. And most parts of the body you can't reduce. You can't reduce the size of the heart. You can't reduce the size of the kidneys or the adrenals or the spleen and so on. But you can reduce the size of the gut if you happen to be able to develop access to a really high quality diet. And that's what we did. We got the smallest guts of any primate and we got the largest brains. And I think that what's happened is that as our cooking became really skillful, our guts required less and less energy to digest our food, and we were able to get increasingly large brains.
Why by cooking we use so much more energy from our food?
Well, the astonishing thing about the nutritional science of cooking is that until recently there's been absolutely no consensus about what cooking does. My theory is cooking gives us energy. This is because a lot of our food comes from starch, and everyone knows that when you heat starch, then you increase the degree to which it is digestible. Instead of excreting a lot of it unused, you eat all of it. Now, my colleagues and I have found something like 7 different mechanisms by which cooking increases the amount of energy you get from your food. Sometimes it's denaturing. You open up a protein to the point where the strands of the amino acids can be accessible by the digestive enzymes. Maybe it's with lipids. You're reducing the size of the lipid particles to the point where they're easier to digest. In all sorts of ways, we find that there are biochemical reasons or biophysical reasons why cooking will give us more energy. We find lots of evidence that animals that eat cooked food acquire more energy. And so we think that the signature feature of the human diet, the fact that we cook, is critical because it gives us energy, and that means that we become a totally different kind of species.
We consume less energy when we digest cooked food.
We spend less energy in the digestion, and a higher percentage of the food that we eat, or the nutrients that we eat, get digested. So with protein, although the evidence is still restricted to only raw eggs, here's this astonishing datum that if we eat an egg raw, then something between 1/3 and 1/2 of the protein is passed through our body without being digested. Whereas if we eat it cooked, over 90% of it is digested.
There's this trend now for raw food. Lots of people think that it's healthier. What do you have to say to them?
I think raw food is a great way to go in a world in which we overeat. Because the single thing that we clearly know about raw food is that it leads to less energy. And many people, 25% of some of the big samples, have chronic energy shortage if they eat raw food. Well, that's fine if you're trying to lose weight, and it's a great diet. It can be healthy. You've got to be careful about some loss of calcium in the bones. You've got to be careful about some of your blood chemicals, but many people get advantages because in addition to losing weight, they have fewer allergic reactions. There are some people who are allergic to some of the products of cooking. So, you know, individuals vary, and I'm actually very admiring of the people who go onto raw food diets because it takes tremendous will. You know, you've got to resist the delicious smells of cooked food and instead put a lot of work into making your food reasonably tasty and put up with some of the sort of disadvantages of drinking a tremendous amount of water with your food and urinating a lot, and it's all very difficult to eat with your friends because they're eating cooked food and so on. So hats off to the people who managed to do it.
Who started cooking?
You mean men or women, or well, you know, so I think the species that started cooking was the Haberlines, and the Haberlines immediately became the first human as a consequence of cooking.
How did cooking lead to the division of labor, sexual division of labor?
Other than modern urban industrial society where the men can become socially liberated sometimes, but in all the societies around the world, women do the domestic cooking. Men may cook on feast days, they may cook if they got some special, exciting piece of food, but women are expected to do it. And I think once you start reflecting on the consequences of cooking, you realize that it's likely to have had very important effects on gender from the beginning. One of the amazing things that it does to us is that it immensely reduces the amount of time we spend chewing. If we were a chimpanzee, we would spend about half our day literally just chewing our food. Well, we don't. We spend less than an hour a day chewing our food, so we got lots and lots of free time. Now, here's the way that the time is used by different people. In small-scale hunter-gatherer, small-scale farming society, women use the time they spend, or the time they would have spent chewing, on preparing food, getting the fire organized, digging the food up and preparing it and getting the fuel. So they don't gain very much. But men are much more free, because men use the time, several hours a day, that they would have spent chewing food on going out and doing things that they want to do. Sometimes they want to hunt. Sometimes they want to go and visit girlfriends in some other village. Sometimes they want to go to war. Sometimes they want to lie under a tree and chat about the weather. They have a lot of options that women don't have to the same extent. And so I think that the invention of cooking probably contributed to this to a large extent because of the way in which men took advantage of them being physically superior in terms of fighting. And it's this: if a man was hungry at the end of the day, he could steal a woman's food because he would know where she was cooking, he could smell the smoke, he could find the fire, she's got to wait while it gets ready, and he could then just come and take it from her. And I think that the way that we now see a gendered society in which within marriages women cook for their husbands can be viewed as a consequence of that ancient dynamic by which men could take a woman's food, and so we now have a system in which a woman is institutionally expected to cook for her husband, and on the basis of that relationship there is a societal norm that says no other man is allowed to take food from her. And if he does, then the husband will get the other men to come along and say, hey, that guy, he's out of here.
But what's the advantage for the woman? What does the woman take from that?
Well, I mean, to some extent, women, of course, are trapped by this. And you often find in accounts of small-scale society that women don't particularly want to get married, but they're forced to. But there are advantages, and the big one is that the man will bring in resources. He brings in meat in hunting and gathering societies, and in modern society he brings in a salary. So, you know, there's a lot of complementary and collaborative aspects to the relationship, of course.
One thing that cooking also encouraged was sociability. You had to sit around a fire, you have to be tolerant of your neighbors.
Yeah, don't you think, I mean, it's so interesting that humans have got this amazing ability for relative strangers like you and me just to sit with each other and look at each other eye face to face and relax in a way that primates in general do not. So we're very socially tolerant, and that tolerance is particularly evident around a fire. Fires change moods, people become very relaxed together, and they need to be, because when you get several people coming around to eat, then they literally have to be in close physical proximity. Well, in the primates, when chimpanzees are all in close physical proximity with each other around a hunk of meat that they all want to eat, then they're all fighting like mad. There's intense competition, and it takes a lot of time before they can sit and relax together. I think it's very reasonable to think that natural selection has favored in humans a temperament that predisposes us to be able to be calm in close proximity to each other, and that close proximity was initially forced on us by the fire.
Do you cook your own meals?
I'm currently a housemaster in a Harvard house where I eat institutional food all the time. But before that, no, I was totally traditional, actually. You know, my wife would cook the meals in the way that happens so often.
Why is the last chapter called The Well-Informed Cook?
I think that nowadays people need to know more about the quality of the nutrition than we do. It took me a lot of research to realize what it is that cooking is doing to our food. And part of the reason it was so difficult for me to do the research is that the nutritional wisdom, as represented by the food labels that we see in our supermarkets, pays no attention to the consequences of food processing for the number of calories in our food. So we don't know, we, the general public, we do not appreciate the fact that when our food is more finely ground or better cooked or better processed in a variety of ways, we get more calories out of it. And that means that if we're trying to live in a harmonious balance so that we maintain a certain body weight, we need to know this. We need to know that processing gives us calories. There is this wonderful experiment in which rats were given the regular kind of laboratory chow on the one hand, or that same chow with air added. It was like taking a grain of wheat or puffed wheat. So your breakfast cereal is puffed compared to the ordinary. They found that when they ate the same number of measured calories, the rats that were eating the puffed food gained more weight. They had 30% more body fat, and they were significantly heavier than the rats that had eaten the harder food. We now are like those rats, eating that puffed food. It's the same number of calories, but we get more out of it. We're getting fatter as a result.
So our ancestors, they started by eating meat. That's
Yes.
what made the difference with the other apes.
Before we started cooking, even if you take my inference that we started cooking maybe 2 million years ago, it's very clear that before then we had ancestors that were eating meat off large animals, equivalent of large things like horses.
Something that the other primates didn't do?
That's right. It began at least 2.5 million years ago, and it was unique in the primate lineage.
Because they cut the meat?
The evidence is that at the time you start finding cut marks on bones, you also find the stones that have been flaked to deliberately make like a knife. So around 2.5 million years ago, our ancestors started eating meat, and this was probably very significant because one of the possibilities is that it gave rise to the discovery of the control of fire. Here is how. In order to eat meat, with our small round teeth, or the teeth were larger, but they were still round and relatively flat, you need to be able to produce something a bit like steak tartare. You know, I've seen chimpanzees eat meat. They don't find it very easy at all. It takes them a lot of hard work to chew and chew and chew. But if you pound the meat to make it into steak tartare, then it's much easier to eat and you can eat it more quickly. Okay, so I think that's probably what the Haberline ancestors of humans were doing. Well, if you try taking even an 1.5 inch thick steak, putting it on a rock, and then taking another rock and pounding it gently to make a nice mash of meat, you get sparks. Sparks come off, and they were doing this for at least 500,000 years. Maybe they were constantly starting little fires around them, and then eventually they started to learn to control them.
So more than carnivores, we are human because we are cooks.
We are cooks more than carnivores, because the big changes happened after the meat-eating period, when doubtless we were eating meat still, but we were cooking it. And that's the point at which you get these big changes. You get much more energy from the diet, which enables us to walk long distances and therefore invest in the locomotor apparatus that allows us to stride. It gives us the big brains. It changes the nature of the food distribution so that we're all having to crowd around a fire. And it makes food so much easier to eat that we have our small teeth and small guts. All of those big changes happen with cooking and not with meat.
You took one of the hints for this importance of cooking in our evolution, a little from Lévi-Strauss, who studied the Brazilian natives.
Yes, right. Lévi-Strauss was the amazing ethnographer in the 1930s, I guess, was a lot of his work, of Brazilian tribes. And he was fascinated by the importance of cooking. But for him, the importance of cooking was entirely psychological. He just assumed, as many people did, that the fact that we can eat much of our food raw means that raw food is just as good as cooked. And so he said, the reason that we so insist on cooking is to separate ourselves in our minds from the animals. The humans are the ones that cook, the animals eat their food raw. Well, he was right about that, but if only he'd just taken a little bit further, and he could have seen the biology as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Para saber mais sobre essa entrevista e deixar sua opinião, visite o blog do Milênio no site da Globo News.